Have you ever thought about how each of us got to where we are today? I've often asked myself, what are all the things that I did right to get into an Ivy League college and then earn a six-figure salary as a 21-year-old? Well, turns out, all I really had to do right was to be born into the right household and right neighborhood. From then on, the odds were in my favor. Unlike many of us here today, Tayshana Murphy was not so lucky. Tayshana grew up in New York City public housing until the age of 18, when she was gunned down in the hallway outside her home. Her friends were wrapped up in a gang rivalry. She had suffered an asthma attack the day before, something that disproportionately affects children living in substandard housing, and couldn't run away fast enough. She was a star basketball player and would have been the first person in her family to go to college. Through a community development corporation I was working with at the time, I met Tayshana's dad. We gathered in a makeshift meeting space in West Harlem, a block away from where Tayshana was killed. He stood in front of me, side by side with the mother of Tayshana's killer. An unfathomable alliance. Their pain suppressed by their resolve to end the vicious cycle of losing their sons and daughters to early graves, literally or figuratively at the hands of the NYPD. Together, they pleaded for after-school programs, a basketball court, a new community center, all of which I took for granted growing up. Unfortunately, for children living in poverty, Tayshana's story is the rule, not the exception, because where you grow up makes you who you are. This is not a talk about the failures of the criminal justice system, though, and that certainly plays a role. This is about a future with better neighborhoods as the pathway to change. Let's start with evidence. Harvard economist Raj Chetty used tax records to track virtually every American born in the late 70s to early 80s. There are three findings I want to share with you. First, poverty is intergenerational. A child born poor will only have a 7.5% chance of becoming rich. Second, children born into poverty are more affected by where they grow up. Some places lifted them out of poverty, but most trapped them. But those rare places that fostered upward mobility have four characteristics in common. They were integrated, had a mix of incomes and races, had better schools, greater social capital, and more stable family structures. And finally, access to opportunity is unequal. Fewer than 5% of Black children grew up in environments that better their long-term prospects. And it's not just about economic outcomes. Where you grow up also affects the most fundamental of measures, life expectancy. Today in Chicago, just a few subway stops can result in a 16-year difference in life expectancy at birth. In New Orleans, a baby born in the poorest neighborhood will live 25 years less than a baby born just 4 miles away in the most affluent neighborhood. I have to admit, it wasn't until I was a freshman at Brown, after I had spent time tutoring students in Olneyville and Providence, that I began to scratch the surface of understanding how environment can undermine a child's long-term prospects. The tale of two cities plays out in Providence, too. Up on College Hill lies my alma mater. nestled amongst quintessential New England homes, frozen in time under the protective blanket of historic preservation laws. Down the hill lies Olneyville, a largely Hispanic neighborhood where more than 40% of families live below the poverty line. Olneyville was hit hard by the subprime mortgage crisis. Block after block of foreclosures, houses boarded up, yards overgrown with weeds. Shattered glass and broken siding strung all over from vandalism and squatting by drug users. The despondent air outside was stifling. If this was the reality that I woke up to and saw outside the classroom window every single day, the concentration of neglect, what kind of future would I have dared to imagine for myself? Would I still have been able to beat the odds if the odds say that there's a greater chance for incarceration than graduating high school? These questions have stayed with me for the past 12 years, driving my career decisions from studying urban planning to leaving my consulting job to work on bringing more affordable housing, schools, and childcare centers to underserved areas of New York City. Looking ahead, I want to offer a new paradigm from my own childhood. From the age of 9 to 19, I lived through what it meant to be poor after my family immigrated to the US. My dad was a PhD student, supporting us on $10,000 a year. I received free and reduced lunch at school. And my mom's weekly ritual was counting tips she received from waiting tables at the local Chinese restaurant, one of the few places that would take informal workers like her. Yet, the affordable housing community that I lived in bred connection and promise. Outside of every building, there were playgrounds with swing sets that became the go-to place for heart-to-hearts with my best friend long into the night. There was a community center where my friends and I would gather for movies, crafts, and English practice with volunteer tutors. Families moved a little bit further after saving enough to afford their own townhomes or houses, but that meant my parents could always count on having someone to help out with the bills on a rainy day, and I could count on continuing to see my friends at school. I recognize that my option of living in affordable housing affiliated with the university where my dad was getting his PhD is in itself a privilege. That's exactly the problem. The ability to live in environments that better our long-term prospects shouldn't just be for the few with the right family background or skin color. It should be for everyone. Join me in realizing this vision. Of course, I don't expect you to pursue careers in community development or urban policy as I have, though I'd be thrilled. And if you haven't already done so, I'd encourage you to give back to communities that you have connections to. Instead, I want all of us to re-examine whether some of the things that we hold dear are actually perpetuating the status quo. Our desire to preserve peace and character in our own neck of the woods, could that be shutting out entire classes of people and skin colors? Our drive to give our children the best education possible, could that be depriving local public schools of much-needed resources and political capital? And finally, our affinity for like-minded individuals, could that be numbing our compassion towards the plight of others? Are we all complicit? Can we each contribute more? Our prospects in life shouldn't be left to the sheer chance of the neighborhood or household that we're born into, because where you grow up makes you who you are. We need to work together to end the tide, to turn the tide of the punishing effects of intergenerational poverty. We need to end the tale of two cities. Join me in changing destiny, one neighborhood at a time.